Ave Maria, welcome back to No Apologies. Today we're going to get back on track with our 6 steps to Catholicism. If you recall, we're on our 4th step, which is to prove that Christianity is the religion worthy of belief. And we mentioned that before we take a look at the actual claims of Jesus Christ, we have to first show that the 4 Gospels, which record the life of Jesus Christ, are reliable, accurate historical accounts. So the main point of today's vlog is to show first that the writers that are assigned to the 4 books of the Gospel did in fact write them. Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now the importance of this is that it shows that the Gospels were all written well within the 1st century, at least before 70 AD. And this then assures us that the accounts are either written by eyewitnesses themselves or by those who personally heard the eyewitnesses recount what they had seen and what they had experienced. And this then removes the objection that the Gospels have been written at some time after the Apostles, and so could have been just fabricated stories or exaggerated myths which someone had written down and therefore are unreliable. Now our evidence to the contrary of that objection falls into 3 categories: internal evidence, that is within the Gospels themselves; external evidence, things outside of the Gospels; and then based on reason, that is the watchful guard of the apostles and the immediate disciples. So we'll begin with the internal evidence. If you look at the Gospels, there's no question that the authors were Jewish, and if you look at the accounts of the political and the historical references within the Gospel, they were Jewish men living within the 1st century. Palestine is shown under the conditions before the fall, which took place in the year 70, before the fall of Jerusalem, which took place in the year 70 AD. Had they been written after that date, if the writers were to be at all consistent with everything else that they wrote, they would have certainly pointed out that Christ's prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem had been fulfilled, that one stone wasn't to be left upon another, but there's no mention of this. And we also point out that all the descriptions of the events and of the conversations between Christ and the people, sometimes between large groups of people and sometimes between just 1 or 2 individuals, are so vivid and detailed that they really could only have been known by eyewitnesses, by people who had experienced themselves or who had gotten the accounts from those who had experienced it. So our internal evidence is based then on the political and the historical references within the Gospels and based on the details of the accounts which are given us. Our external evidence, we have first of all the writings of a man named Papias, who was a disciple of St. John the Apostle and who there's no question lived within the 1st century. And in his writings he says 2 things which are of importance for us today. One, he says, one named Matthew first wrote in Hebrew, and then secondly, he says one named Mark wrote what he had heard from St. Peter. So, of course, Papias could not have written those things had those 2 evangelists not already written their Gospels. And secondly, we have what they call the Muratorian Fragment, which is a parchment which was found in Milan and which is dated at least back to the year 170 AD. And in this parchment, it just tells us plainly that the 3rd Gospel was written by Luke and that the 4th by John. And there really is no other external evidence which gives us any reason to believe the contrary. There is only speculation and opinion. Now, as for the watchful guard of the apostles and the early disciples, it's safe to say that they would have never allowed a forgery to be put forth as something genuine. If this were the case, the enemies of the early church would have found their strongest arguments against Christianity in the fact that their own documents were frauds, that is, not written by the intimate disciples of our Lord. But again, we have no record of this. And also, because all of the regions to where Christianity spread readily accepted the 4 Gospels, had someone attempted to put forth some kind of a fraud, it would have been immediately recognized by the others in other regions, and there would have been a universal protest. So we say, based on our internal evidence, based on our external evidence, and based on the dutifulness and the watchfulness of the apostles and the early disciples. There is no reason to doubt or disbelieve that the Gospels were, in fact, written by those to whom they're attributed: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Thanks for joining me on No Apologies. Ave Maria.